Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah. Well, this, I'm going to ask folks to do some, before I open it up for questions, I'm going to ask them to talk with somebody seated next to them. So maybe instead of paired, three groups of 3 or 4. That way they can ask a question from the group without any Good.
And then,
Yep.
okay, that's a good way to do it.
Yeah, perfect. Because I don't want to ask you all to leave the room. Didn't burn it on.
Right here. So, change that.
Hello? Hello? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. I know not everybody's here, and most importantly of all, we don't have the coffee cups, which is, required fun here, and cookies, which they are on their way. Anthony's quite apologetic, but anyway, he's getting ready to show up. So as soon as he gets here, please feel free to get up while people are talking, and Richard will not take offense. We did this survey, I guess, in about 3 or 4 years ago, and one of the things that came out of it from our findings there was that our employees wanted to know that if they did good work, that there was a recognition, an opportunity for recognition. And what came out of that is the STARS program, which has grown every year. We not only recognize people who win the service awards, but also the Employee of the Month award, but also we have some special awards that come out and they're chosen by a committee here. So that's an example of something that came out of Great Colleges Work For survey. This is a survey that's done nationally. You have to sign up to do it. The first time we did the survey 4 years ago, we did not do the full campus. It's a little cheaper to do it that way. This time we really felt like we wanted input from everybody. So this particular survey was sent out to every full-time employee here. We had a good survey turn up. You'll see that from the data. And one of the things that Richard does and Modern Think does is take the data from this and kind of groups it into things that you do well, things that you need to work on, and then opportunities for improvement. And the thing that I've been grateful for, because I've had a chance to see the report, is the suggestions that they have of things that it would be good for us to work on. And so there's some things in here about senior leadership, and we all agreed as a senior team that we wanted to work on those, and we are. This is going to take a project, and we're not going camping together, but we're going to spend some more quality time together with each other to better understand who we are as individuals and how we can better serve the institution. So that's one small example, but I am standing between you and a very efficient and very accomplished human being. Richard has done a great job of explaining it this morning, and he's going to do it again this afternoon for us. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm eager for that coffee to get here as well, right? This is I'm always sensitive about afternoon presentations, particularly those in that 2 o'clock window after lunch, where everybody's susceptible to the term that I was introduced to years ago, food coma, right? Where all the blood rushes to our stomachs. But in any case, when the coffee does come, please feel free to help yourself. I won't take offense to that. So before I jump in, let me do a couple things just in terms of context and background. Just by a show of hands, how many folks are familiar with the Great Colleges to Work For program? All right, so some, not quite as many as this morning. So this is a project that we've been working on. We initiated this project back in 2007 in partnership with the Chronicle of Higher Education. We were initially talking with the folks over at CUPA HR, the Professional Association for HR Professionals within higher ed, about doing essentially a recognition program, kind of like Fortune Magazine's program, the 100 Best Companies to Work For, but just for colleges and universities. Both those organizations thought that this was that would be work that would find a receptive audience in the world of higher education. That the reality is that if we do kind of almost an industry or sector analysis, higher ed has not been as intentional about kind of a strategic focus on workplace quality, organization culture, and human capital. Now, we're starting to see that gap close, but historically, we've seen many other kind of industries be much more thoughtful about that. That, as I say, that gap is closing. So this Great Colleges to Work For program, we've been doing it since 2007. We've surveyed, at this point, close to 1,400 colleges and universities as a function of that and/or our work with others. So we work with colleges and universities outside of the context of that program as well. By way of comparison and context, if you take the for-profits out of the equation, there's about 4,700 colleges in this country today. So it gives you some insight in terms of the benchmarking capabilities we have. It also gives you some insight in terms of the lens through which I'll be looking at your data. So when I suggest this is a strength or this is an opportunity, that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. I did an exercise with the group this morning at the end of the session, but given where we are now, I think I want to do it at the beginning of the session here, because it also is a good tone setter, if you will. So I'm going to ask you to indulge me in just one quick exercise. It's a super simple one. You don't have to leave your seat or do anything crazy. All I'm going to simply ask you to do is to go ahead and cross your arms as you normally would, right? So just go ahead and cross your arms as you normally would. And now what I'll ask you to do is look at how you've got your arms crossed. So for me, I've got my left hand open on my right bicep. My right hand is in a fist underneath my left bicep. So now that you've got that, and I was teasing the group this morning that some folks needed a second cup of coffee to do this exercise, but what I'll ask you to do now is go ahead and cross them the exact opposite way. All right? And we'll do a remedial lesson for those who are struggling at the end. All right. And go ahead and shake it out real quick. All right. So here's our first opportunity for some audience interaction. I'm curious, somebody tell me what that felt like. What was that like? It was natural or unnatural? For you, it was natural. For you, it was unnatural. Yeah, a little awkward. What else? It was awkward? I saw some of you looking like you had to think about it a little bit, right? So for some, it was natural. For others, it was unnatural. Required a little bit of mental effort. And dare I say, was it uncomfortable in addition to being unnatural for some of you? I would suggest probably so by some of the head nods I see. And you all know who you are in the room. I'm not going to point you out, but there were a couple of you who, what'd you do once you got it crossed the exact opposite way? You went right back to what was comfortable, right? And that exercise, as simple as it is a great metaphor for change. And this institution has had a lot of change in the recent past, and you're going to continue to have some change. And change is all of those things that we just talked about with this little exercise. It requires some thought. It can be a little uncomfortable, maybe unnatural. There's a tendency to want to go back. So to the extent that you've encountered some of that during some of the change that you all have experienced, or to the extent you anticipate potentially some of those reactions, given some of the potential impending change, I think that can just be a useful exercise to know that that's all part of the change process. All right, and that'll become even more clear why I did that here by the time we get through this session. I've got a couple agenda items in terms of objectives I want to try and cover in the limited time we have here. I want to talk a little bit about strategic linkages in terms of what are the potential uses of this data that we have here. Y'all have done other surveys before. You've obviously done a number of student surveys. You've done some coach, some faculty surveys. This is a different type of survey, and we'll talk about some of the potential applications of this data. I'll talk a little bit about the survey instrument. We're not going to go into great detail, but we spend a lot of time developing the survey instrument back in 2007. We convene a blue ribbon panel of experts every 3 years from across higher ed to advise us both on the instrument as well as the methodology we use in the Great Colleges to Work For program. And so this is the instrument we used here. We'll talk a little bit about that. I'll share with you, as President Henders said, some key findings. We'll do that via an abbreviated SWOT analysis. We'll talk about strengths and opportunities, essentially. And then I'll share with you some recommendations, and we'll certainly have time for questions and talk a little about some next steps. So having said that, before we talk a little bit more about strategic linkages, let me talk about how I think about surveys. So on one hand, a survey is a diagnostic tool. It's an assessment tool. It gives us insight into the health of a culture at a particular point in time. I would also suggest, by its very nature, though, a survey is also a communication tool, right? We're going to very intentional efforts. We're making very intentional efforts to ask people what they think. And it is only good survey practice then to play that back to the community. Here's what we found. So we deployed the survey in February, March. I was here about a month ago doing a preliminary findings presentation to the senior leadership team. And then next phase of the socialization or the dissemination of the findings or the town hall meetings that we're doing today. This is not the last step in the process. Now, you all did do a survey back in 2013 via the Great Colleges to Work For program. And as President Henderson mentioned, this time you all oversampled. So rather than just survey a representative sample of the population, it was a very intentional choice made. And I think, I'll encourage you. I'm not a shill for the administration. Nobody's told me what I can or can't say. And I'll encourage you to look for evidence of this survey being different and look for evidence for the institutional and leadership commitment to this process. So the institution made a decision, we're going to survey everybody because we want to give everybody a chance to have their voice heard. Right? So that's To the extent that you're not sure if this really is going to be different or it's going to have any impact, you've got a data point there that there's a different level of commitment. So we're now we deployed the survey, we're in the process of communicating the results. Because you don't have a long history doing this survey or surveys like this, you don't necessarily have a roadmap to follow in terms of how you're going to cascade the results or what the action planning looks like. I've been in dialogue with Sue and Natalie, Institutional Effectiveness and Human Resources, who have been running point on this project around some things to consider. You'll hear Dr. Henderson talk about the current thinking regarding some task force that will be convened to help better understand the survey findings and actually identify some things that we can actually do, that you can actually do moving forward. And my colleagues and I at Modern Think will support in whatever ways make sense. But I share with you that because it is a work in progress in some regards. So in terms of strategic linkages, this, as I said, it's an assessment, gives us insight into the culture, and it has the capability to do much more than just determine how happy, in fact, our faculty and staff are. So you all are essentially extending your existing, or have extended your existing strategic plan. And having looked at that strategic plan, it is not a stretch for me to make some connections between some of the items in this survey and some of the things in your strategic plan. Similarly, as many of you know, if not firsthand from your work in it, you probably are aware that there's work being done for Middle States accreditation. It is not an accident that a number of the items here in this survey map to some of the criteria and standards that Middle States and other accreditors are looking at. So look at and are interested in looking at. So this has potential to help you put your best foot forward as you're doing those kinds of self-studies, whether it be this one or upcoming. I was also sharing this morning and with your senior leadership team, we're seeing a lot more interest from boards on this kind of data. We're seeing boards that want to make sure that their leaders, their presidents, their chancellors, their cabinets, leadership teams are being good stewards of human resources as well as good stewards of financial resources. One of the other pieces, and you all have had some transition and you're in the midst of more transition now, when there is leadership transition, particularly at the president, chancellor, or provost level, that's also tends for some institutions to be an impetus for do this kind of data collection. And for a new provost coming in or a new CFO coming in, having data like this can fast track their onboarding process, help them get understanding of the lay of the land much quicker than just kind of the school of hard knocks and having to do it as a function of just time on, boots on the ground and time in the role. When an institution has mission, clearly articulated mission and associated values, it's easy to connect some of these statements regarding values. Now today, you all don't necessarily have an articulated set of values that everybody is behind. There's been some work done on values. I think that's important work for you to potentially consider. But when you have values, and you all have some, I would suggest some unarticulated values. They may not be in a value statement, but clearly you all have made a tremendous commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Not just in terms of the students, but even in terms of your community of faculty and staff. So inherent in that is a value. And there are items that we can look at this survey, 3 in particular of the core items, that give us some insight into what faculty staff experience is of the organizational commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, as well as the experience of a welcoming environment. So anytime we can make these connections so that people don't see this survey data as an isolated initiative, that this is just the flavor of the month, it's a IEHR tool that, we just got to wait this out. When that's the dynamic at play, this kind of data really, frankly, is not used as well as it can be. But when we're making these connections so that people see how these things are related, whether it be related to the coach survey or any of these other things we talked about, it helps reinforce everything. And it minimizes survey fatigue. All right, let's talk a little bit about the survey instrument. I mentioned the survey timeline. So it was an online survey deployed in February through March 9th of 2018. Our first data point that we'll talk about is the response rate. So we had a 43% response rate on this survey. By way of context, our typical response rate in the Great Colleges to Work For program typically ranges between 36 and 46%. A lot of that has to do, some with institution size, some with survey history. So there's a number of different factors that play into that. We generally see a little lower response among faculty. When we're doing surveys outside of the context of that program, and we can be even more intentional about an associated communication plan prior to deploying the survey, it's not atypical for us to get response rates at the 60, 70, 80% level. Bottom line, at 43%, it's probably about where I'd expect, given this deployment of the survey. And when we look at the confidence levels and margins of errors, when we're looking at the data set in its entirety as a whole, we can operate with a high degree of confidence that is in fact reflective of the population. We asked a number of demographic questions, so we can disaggregate this data set in lots of different ways: faculty status, academic, college essentially, and department. So when we look at those and we have smaller n's, smaller number of respondents, the confidence intervals are going to shift a little bit, so we have to look at how reflective they are of the population as a whole. But when we look at the data set, as I say, in its entirety, we can operate with a high degree of confidence. It is, in fact, reflective of the population. Got some benchmarking capabilities given our database. The one we're going to focus mostly on today is institutions who we've surveyed in 2018 who share your same Carnegie classification. There's another benchmark that we provided you all regarding what we call the honor roll benchmark. And for those who aren't familiar with the Great Colleges to Work For program, there are 12 recognition categories that mirror the dimensions in this survey instrument, which we're going to talk about here momentarily. So any participating institution could be recognized in one or multiple categories. Those institutions that are recognized in the most number of categories achieve a special distinction that we call the honor roll. In 2018, you had to be recognized in 7 or more categories to be on the honor roll. That's our attempt to find essentially an aspirational benchmark, what we think is realistic and actually attainable in terms of the best workplaces we can find in higher ed. The survey itself, there are 60 core belief statements. We call them core statements because those are the ones we ask everybody who's participating in that Great Colleges to Work For survey. You all customize the survey a little bit. In addition to oversampling to include all of your community, you added 10 additional belief statements, and you customize the benefits a little bit, the benefits. We're going to spend most of our time on those 70 core statements here today. We're going to make this deck available to you. One of the things we heard loud and clear in this survey is that faculty and staff both are eager for more of a culture of communication, and in particular are eager for a greater sense of confidence in transparency, in being appropriately transparent, that information is in fact shared in a timely and appropriate manner. So we're going to make the deck available to you afterwards, so you don't have to take copious notes during this. That's where we're going to spend most of our time. There were 2 open-ended questions. Folks had a lot to say. There were over 50 some odd pages of verbatim responses. The first open-ended question is, through an appreciative inquiry lens, what do you appreciate most about working at this institution? In the course of my analysis here, I'll share with you some of the themes that showed up in those verbatims. The second question is more of a solution-oriented question. What do you think would make this a better place to work? So we'll weave those into some of my narrative here. 13 different demographic questions, many of which you would expect in a survey like this: age, gender, race, ethnicity, as well as job role, faculty status, etc. So lots of different ways to disaggregate the data. So we saw the overall response rate. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but here on this slide what you're looking at is the response rate broken down by our job category. So our administration, faculty, exempt, and non-exempt staff. So this is pretty typical of what we would see. It's not uncommon for non-exempt staff to have some of the lower response rates along with faculty. I want to provide a quick rule of thumb prior to getting into actually some additional data. So I mentioned that there was a 70 belief statement. So we ask a statement and we ask you to respond to it on a 5-point agreement scale. You'll see that agreement scale listed at the top of the slide. There is a not applicable up there. That's very infrequently selected, even among your newer faculty and staff. We've tried to design these statements so that even new employees would have a context to provide a meaningful answer. What we're going to do, and what we've done at this point, is a version of what's often called top box analysis, where you're looking at the most favorable response option. But our version here is going to be a top 2-box analysis. So we're going to combine the strongly agree and agree response options and characterize that as a positive response. That's what we're after. On the opposite end of the continuum, we're going to do the same with the strongly disagree and disagree. This guide is intended as a rule of thumb, recognizing that some of these statements are easier to do well on than others. But as a general rule of thumb, this will help us make some quick meaning of a very robust data set. When you see positive response at the 75% level or above, that's kind of in that exceptional level. Most of our benchmarks for our honor roll institutions are going to be at that level or higher. If you have ambitious goals around being an employer of choice, or your ability to attract and retain world-class faculty and staff, or diverse faculty and staff, then anything below 55% on the positive response would point us to an area that probably warrants some attention. Negative response, we expect to see negative response on every one of these items. I start to get curious when I see negative response at the 15% level. And certainly at the 20% level, I'm paying attention. When at that level, it's like that, remember that old dentist commercial, 1 out of 5 dentists recommends this, or 4 out of 5 dentists? Well, essentially at the 20% negative level, we've got 1 in 5 of our community who are experiencing some organizational dynamic or some leadership competency, the exact opposite of how we would want them to. So we need to pay attention there. All right, let's talk a little bit more about a few elements of the survey before we get into the data. So the first are some definitions. So there are a couple terms that we use consistently in those 70 belief statements. Of particular note is how we define senior leadership and supervisor department chair. So regarding supervisor department chair, it's to the individual whom you most directly report. Senior leadership refers to your senior leadership team, the president and her direct reports. All right, so the 15 core survey dimensions. So a good survey, for those of you who do survey research, obviously know it's more than just a collection of cleverly crafted statements. There's got to be some sort of construct, some sort of framework. What we're looking at here are the 15 dimensions. These are the 15 major categories which we can group all of those items under. So essentially, this is a function of the factor analysis. So we see which items are highly correlated. We take a little bit of poetic license with a couple of these dimensions just to make them more user-friendly. If folks have questions in terms of the instrument itself, in terms of reliability, validity, I'm happy to field those offline. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that. But again, this is what we derived as a function of the factor analysis. In terms of dimensions, now we're going to segue into some data. So what we're going to look at is a progression of 3 slides, the first of which is up on the screen right now. So what we're looking at is the positive response, the percent positive response of the statements that comprise these dimensions. So in the supervisor's department chair dimension, by way of example, there are 7 items in that dimension. This is the average positive response across the items in that dimension. And we're comparing it here to that Carnegie class benchmark that I alluded to here moments ago. So we're going to go in decreasing order in terms of your NJCU's results across these 15 dimensions. And this foreshadows some of what we'll talk about in terms of strengths. So this is, before I go too far down this path, let me also just share that for all practical purposes, this is what many folks would refer to as an engagement survey, an employee engagement survey. Now, there's a problem with employee engagement as a construct in that there's no one singular definition of what it is. Essentially, it's an evolution of employee satisfaction, which has its roots in the construct of organizational citizenship. Having said that, while it's not a generally accepted accounting principle where we all agree this is how we calculate return on investment, there is a great deal of consistency in the research on those things that impact or influence an engaged culture. So those are the kinds of things that we ask. And hence, those are the topical areas that you'll see reflected in the themes. In that research, one of the primary drivers of engagement is the experience of one's immediate supervisor. So we know that's an important dynamic. So we ask about that. Good news is we've got some good results there. Doesn't mean there's not room for improvement. But when we look at how faculty and staff are responding regarding these statements that give us insight into the experience, the effectiveness, the credibility of supervisors, we see some pretty good results. Tremendous sense of pride, and this really is echoed in the verbatim responses to the first open-ended question, what do you appreciate most about working at this institution? Real sense of pride for working with the students, for the impact that you all have in the community, and pride in the community and the caliber of the community you have, both in terms of faculty and staff. We'll dissect that a little bit more. We also see some good results on the job satisfaction dimension, which is really about job fit and autonomy. One of the nice things about the autonomy statement is we saw positive response across all job categories. It wasn't isolated just to faculty. Generally, we see higher positive response on those items among our faculty. You do very well on the benefits and the work-life balance statements. Less so on the compensation, but that's okay. Compensation alone doesn't make for a great workplace. And again, we'll tease that out as well. Professional development, like supervisors, department chairs, in most of the engagement research is considered a substantive driver of engagement. Do people feel like there's an opportunity to learn and grow, to advance their skills? Question?
The light blue, is that all universities in our category, or those are the ones that are more successful?
Yeah, so this is the 2018 institutions, so just this past year, that shared your Carnegie classification. So this is not the aspirational benchmark, the honor roll. Having said that, every year we get about 300 colleges that participate in this program.
And for the most part, you got to be a pretty good place to work to throw your hat in the ring, right? We don't see a lot of really lousy workplaces participating in the Great Colleges to Work For program. There are some, but I would suggest just by the very nature, the institutions that participate kind of self-select, so it's not a random sample of institutions from across the country. This is probably higher than what we would see if we did that. Okay, so second of our third in terms of dimension averages. So I'm not going to have a chance to talk to every one of these on these three slides, but I will as our narrative unfolds. I want to talk about collaboration and communication here because they're definitely related. The quality of our communication, the quality of our dialogue influences our ability to collaborate, right? And I was sharing with the group this morning, I've yet to see either a high-performing team or a high-performing organization that collaborates really well that fundamentally doesn't communicate as well. And we could build on that hierarchy because in higher ed, we have a very specific form of collaboration called shared governance. And we're going to tease that out as well. And on the next slide, you'll see actually a shared governance slide. The respect and appreciation and fairness, those in many regards, they go very closely. And frankly, it's not a stretch for me to throw facilities in there as well. When people don't feel like there's adequate facilities or staffing, sometimes that's viewed through a fairness lens. It's not fair for you to expect me to perform at this level if we don't have the resources that we need. Or you're not appreciating how hard we're working, given that we don't have the staff that we did 3 years ago and the work is even more. So not surprising that those three dimensions track pretty closely. The third of our three dimension averages slides, and this is bringing up the rear, so you'll note that we're getting much lower responses here. As President Henderson mentioned, one of the things we talked about with the senior leadership team were the results of the senior leadership dimension. We're going to tease those out. And I will tell you that in some cases, so my practice, I've been doing this kind of research for the better part of 20 years. And since 2006, almost exclusively, my focus has been higher ed. And oftentimes when results come back that is not as positive as a cabinet or a senior leadership team thinks they should be or expect it to be, then they shift. There can be a tendency to shift into a dynamic that we in the survey business call data denial, right? We look to dismiss the results. We don't like the timing of the survey. We don't like Modern Think. Who's this great colleges? We don't like that either. Sometimes they don't even like me. So I will tell you that in my work with your senior leadership team, I didn't really run into any substantive data denial. Yeah, was there some angst or agita that some of these results were a little bit lower than we would have hoped for? Absolutely. But I found them to be very open to the data and very invested in using this to support the good work you all are trying to do. So again, I'm not a shill for administration. Nobody's told me what to say or what not to say. And I think I'll encourage you to look for evidence for their commitment moving forward, whether it be, as President Henders said, their commitment to looking at their own dynamics as a team and how they work together, or their commitment to this as an ongoing process and not just a one-off survey that we do every 7 years or whatever the number is. We'll talk about survey cycle afterwards. Shared governance, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about that as it relates to communication and collaboration because they're all very much connected. So let's look at some statements. So this is a design of a slide that we're going to see a number that look very similar to this. So the number on the left, on the far left, is the number of the item in the sequence of the survey. So that's item 25, 36, et cetera. Then we've got the belief statement itself, followed by the positive and negative for NJCU, and then the positive and negative for the benchmark. So there is, I've got a number of little aphorisms I've collected over the years in terms of building great workplaces. And one of those I alluded to regarding compensation. You can't simply buy your way into being a great workplace. I've seen lots of organizations where people are paid very, very well, and their people are equally miserable, right? Another is that great workplaces tend to start at the local level. If you are unhappy in your work group, on your team, in your department, it is highly unlikely you're going to experience the organization as a whole as a great place to work. So we've actually got a pretty nice finding here. In fact, a very solid finding on item 25 when we're asking about the experience in the workplace, the department. My department is a good place to work. At 70 and 10, that's a solid finding. Not necessarily at that 75% elite threshold, but it's a positive finding. That sense of pride that I alluded, I'll characterize a pervasive theme in the verbatim responses regarding to the first question, what do you appreciate most about working here? And one of the higher scoring items on item 36. Item 59 is an interesting one, and this is the first of several items that I would suggest are differentiating qualities of great workplaces. At the very best workplaces we can find, and this is not isolated to higher ed, while most of my work is in higher ed, I have colleagues and have worked in other industries and sectors and involved with over 25 different best place to work programs like the Chronicle. And I can tell you that across those, this is a dynamic that we see pretty consistently. Item 59, the perception of a special and unique culture among faculty and staff or among employees, when we see that item is highly predictive at great workplaces of how you're going to do on item 60. All things considered, this is a great place to work. Great places to work tend to have a commonly held perception of what's special and unique about that community, about that as a place of employment. There's another item we're going to throw into the mix here as well shortly, item 58, which is also related to item 59. I have no doubt, I mean, I've seen your survey data, I've read all the verbatim responses, I've looked at your strategic plan, I've looked at a number of associated documents on the website and otherwise. There's no doubt in my mind that you all have the raw material for a pretty compelling story regarding what's special and unique about this organization, about this university. That narrative just hasn't been woven together in an intentional or consistent way. But I think all the pieces are there. Item 60, when we expand the frame of reference, and item 25, all things considered now, this is a great place to work, see a substantive decline there. And that, I think you'll see, is not a surprise when we look at some of the thematic analysis, which we're going to switch to momentarily. All right, so I mentioned we're going to do a SWOT analysis here, or abbreviated SWOT analysis. Here are the major headlines in terms of the strengths and the opportunities, and we're going to unpack these one at a time here momentarily. Before we do that, let me share with you another differentiating quality of great workplaces. So the first one we've got on our list is perception of a special and unique culture. The second is at great workplaces, there tends to be a consistency of experience. They're not just great workplaces for senior leadership or for tenured faculty or for your most long-tenured staff, right? There's a consistency of the experience. So one of the things that we want to look at is, and in this slide, we're looking at the overall positive response across the 60 core items. So we're not including the 10 custom items here, but the 60 core items, because we can do comparative analysis on those, by job category. So the N's are the number of respondents, and here, with the exception of our IFPTE folks, where we have a small n, even though our faculty at 46%, this is, in many regards, pretty consistent. We don't see a huge range across our job categories. Similarly, when we look at by academic or division, certainly there are some differences. I'm not trying to downplay or minimize the differences, but they're certainly not as large as what we might normally expect given an institution with kind of this, not just the survey history, but your recent history. And when we look at the departments, we see a fair bit of consistency as well. There's not any one particular group that has a monopoly on feeling under-resourced, underpaid, or conversely, any group that's saying, oh, my supervisors or department chairs are better than everybody else. There's a certain amount of consistency of experience. All right, I know we're throwing a lot into the mix. This is, the next two slides is I was teasing this morning, it's my homage to David Letterman. These are the top 10 statements. So there were 70 belief statements. These are the 10 where we saw the highest positive response. Many of these are going to surface in our thematic analysis, but I want to highlight a couple here, particularly as they're related to engagement. So item 5, I understand how my job contributes to this institution's mission. In the engagement research, this is considered a primary driver of engagement. Can you draw a straight line between what you do on a daily basis and how it impacts the institution's mission? At 85 and 4, that's a terrific finding, and that's echoed in the verbatim responses. Good relationship, it's important, but good relationship alone doesn't make for a good manager. I suspect we all probably have had an experience of having a supervisor at some point that we liked, but we didn't think was a very good manager. This is, however, a good foundation to build on, particularly when we see that the supervisor is doing some things well, right? And here in item 47, the support for work-life balance, it's a pretty good finding. That's one of the items in that compensation, benefits, and work-life balance dimension. Item number 2 I alluded to, this is essentially the antithesis of being micromanaged. Do people feel like they have the autonomy, the responsibility, the freedom to do their job? And again, in this data set, one of the nice findings was there a consistency of response across all job categories. This wasn't just strong among our faculty. Item 61, you'll see the asterisk by that. That's one of our custom statements to NJCU, so we don't have benchmark data, hence those boxes aren't filled there. And we asked, there are 3 core items regarding diversity, equity, inclusion. We asked a couple others, this being one of them, and it's 71 and 13, one of the higher scoring items. The second half of our top 10, we saw item 25, one of the barometer statements. I'm not sure I defined barometer statements earlier, but in our world, we would describe a barometer statement as one where there may not be anything specifically actionable in the item, but we know it's giving us an insight into some dynamic that is important, right? So item 25 is one of those barometer statements. So supervisors are doing some good things. So I think among the most important things a good manager does is make expectations clear. That's what we're getting at in item 3 at 17 and 15. It's a pretty good finding. Item number 1 is about job fit. So it's really, depending on who you read, both the job satisfaction as well as employee engagement and employee satisfaction item, it's an important one regardless what lens you're looking through. 36, tremendous sense of pride. That's a pervasive theme in the verbatim responses to question 1. Tremendous sense of pride about the impact you all are having and the work that you're doing. 15 is a value statement, which is also about credibility. All right, so let's unpack these strengths. So we looked at our top 10, and hold on, because in a few minutes we're going to look at the bottom 10. We're going to be transparent, appropriately transparent. I was chatting with a couple folks at lunch about the theme here around transparency, and it's a theme that surfaces for both faculty and staff. More communication, better communication, more timely communication, more transparent communication. And just in terms of managing expectations and the reality of the workplace, whether it be in higher ed or elsewhere, transparency is certainly something to aspire to, and it is in many cases appropriate to have a qualifier, and for me that qualifier is appropriate transparency. There are some things, some conversation topics, whether that be sensitive human resources issues or potential legal issues, that are not going to be for common consumption for everybody. So on the whole, is the institution and our leadership transparent? Yes, we hope so. And that doesn't necessarily translate to everybody has access to everything. It's not good business in some cases, and in some cases it's simply not legal. All right, let's talk about strengths. We saw this headline earlier. 4 key strengths today that I would identify. I'm not pulling those out of a hat. When we talk about job fit, autonomy, and connection to mission, we've seen a number of these items already on the top 10 in the barometer statements. 1 again about job fit, 2 about autonomy, 5 around connection to mission, 36 around pride. This is a nice cluster. On all of these items, we're at the 65% level or higher, which is that good to very good range, and our negative is relatively low here. 2 of these items below 10%. Not necessarily at our Carnegie benchmark, but still a pretty good foundation on which to build. In terms of benefits and work-life balance, this institution's benefits meet my needs. This was also a theme that emerged pretty consistently in response to question number 1 of the verbatim questions. What do you appreciate most about working at this institution? Over and over again, we see faculty and staff both talk about the benefits and the stability of the organization. That's not to say that folks don't want to see even greater security regarding financial solvency and financial strength moving forward, but on the whole, folks very much value the benefits. We saw item 47, where we looked at the supervisor support for work-life balance. Item 53 is related to that. Here we're asking about the institutional's policies and practices. So a pretty substantive gap between those 2 items. And where the rubber hits the road, which is really 47, we see a pretty good finding on that. And it's not just support for work-life balance that our supervisors are doing good work on. We saw item 3 earlier in terms of clear expectations. Again, I think that's among the most important things a good manager does. 12 is a credibility statement. 19 is a statement that's related to credibility, but also kind of the level playing field. Are our supervisors, department chairs, are they consistent and fair in terms of their leadership and their managing of their respective groups? 20 is an important one, particularly if we've got any interests and or language or values regarding innovation and creativity. Right? So my supervisor, department chair, actively solicits my suggestions and ideas. Operative word in that statement is the actively. It's not a passive process. Right? On the whole, pretty good findings on those. It's not to say that there's not room for improvement, but relative strength. So no question, a significant part of this institution and a significant kind of thread of the fabric of your culture is your commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not just in terms of your student body, but in terms of the faculty and staff composition as well. So item 50, one of our core items, we're asking about institutional commitment at 66 and 14, what was one of the higher scoring items. Item 45 gives us some insight into welcoming environment. That's related to a sense of belonging, a little bit different but related at 65 and 13, a pretty good finding. 54, we're seeing a similar pattern, 65 and 12 on this. This, in addition to being a procedural question, I would also suggest is a risk management question. do folks know what the resources are if they feel like they've been aggrieved in some form or fashion? While 65 is solid, it's probably not where we ultimately aspire to be. So there may be, this data may be able to point us to where we need to do some more education slash just communicating what resources and what policies are available. Question?
How does this percentage relate to demographics of who's employed here? So, does the approval of the positive in the diversity reflect the diversity in terms of employees?
Yeah, so there's this, in one of the questions we got this morning, and we're going to do a formal Q&A. I'm happy to field a couple questions. You're okay. You're okay. Let me speak to it now because it's topical and relevant. So there's a lot of different demographic questions: age, gender, race, ethnicity. So these questions, diversity, equity, inclusion items, these are particularly important items to look at from a protected lens, protected status or protected class lens, right? How is it our historically underrepresented groups are responding on these items? What we're looking at here is the overall positive response across everybody who completed the survey. And you do have the ability to look at these by these demographic categories. And we can look at the ends on demographic categories and see how reflective that is of our population to the extent we have that information about our community. On these items, the diversity, equity, inclusion items, not surprisingly, on some of these, notably item number 54, by way of example, those who identified as Black or African American were lower on that than some of the groups. So while the overall results are positive, that doesn't mean to say that there's not continued work that needs to be done. Okay, so those are our strengths. We're now going to look at the opposite of the top 10. We're going to look at the bottom 10. All right, so let's just rip the Band-Aid off and look at the lowest scoring items on the survey. So you keen observers will note a couple of things. We've got some low positives, right? I said 55 was a threshold. We've got some high negatives. I said 20% was a threshold. So in both cases here, we're looking at those that absolutely meet those standards. So there's a theme around resource constraints. We're going to dissect that here momentarily, but one of the resource constraints issues has to do with staffing. It is rare, since 2009, 2010, the aftermath of the recession, it is unusual for me to see a college or university today that does exceptionally well on some of these resource constraint issues, staffing being one of them. Note the benchmark on that is much lower than we've seen on our other benchmark data. Item 58 is the one I alluded to that was related to items 59 and 60. And as you'll recall, item 59, the sense of a special and unique culture, we didn't necessarily distinguish ourselves with excellence on that response. When there is a commonly held perception of what's special and unique about this organization as a place of employment, that tends to bring a community together. So given what we saw on 59, I'm not surprised of this finding here at 58. We'll talk more about that as well. Orientation program prepares new faculty, administration, and staff to be effective. I bet if we were to ask about the orientation program for our students, whether they be transfer students or first-year students, I bet we'd see a much different response. In my experience, most colleges and universities are really good at that part, orientation onboarding, but we're less diligent about our onboarding and orientation of new faculty and staff. This is an item, and we'll talk more about the task force here afterwards, but I have no doubt that with a concerted effort, you all could move the needle on this in relatively short order, right? It is a good onboarding / orientation process. It's not a mystery to be solved. There's some methodical things that we can do, and if you do it in a structured way, you're going to set your people up to be more effective sooner rather than later. 57 is another barometer statement. 67 also echoes a theme that emerges in the verbatim responses, that for some, both faculty and staff, there's a sense that senior leadership, I don't believe that they really care about me as a person, right? They don't really understand what I'm dealing with or how I'm my job is challenged because of our resource constraints or the staffing or what have you, or there's just a lack of connection to. And we see that here in item 67, the perception that faculty and staff believe, that leaders believe people are their most important resource. All right, so let's look at our second half of our bottom 10. So I said earlier that I think among the foundational things that good supervisors do is make expectations clear. From senior leadership, I think one of the most important things they do is provide clear direction. You all had a strategic plan from 2013 to 2018 that has been extended given some of the work that you're doing regarding accreditation. So, that's a relatively recent strategic plan. This is, when I look at survey data, I'm always coming from a place of curiosity, right? What's going on? Why is this happening here? And I'll encourage you as you either look at this data today or subsequently, should you choose to participate in one of the task forces or have additional questions, I would encourage you to be curious about the data, come from a place of inquiry, be solution-oriented, right? What do we do moving forward to make things better? And be of partnership mindset. And I'm going to come back to that theme because in some regards, you all are too small a community to have the response that you do on that previous item 58, the sense that we're all in it together, right? And in some regards, that's incongruent with some of what many of you all say you appreciate most, the sense of community. So we've got a tremendous sense of community that's not necessarily translating to a strong sense of cross-functional collaboration or a strong sense of in it together yet. I think you all have that potential. Okay, so clear direction is among the things that senior leaders are critical for them to do. Item 61 we saw earlier, which had to do with senior leadership caring about me. That's similar to item 37, one of the core items. 16 is a performance management accountability question. We're going to look at a group of those here momentarily. 43 gives us insight into the quality of dialogue. So one of the things that emerges in the verbatims is that faculty and staff both, nobody's got a monopoly on it, are eager for more communication from and with senior leadership, and not just another email blast, right? So real dialogue, real conversation, confidence and transparency. And if that's all we were to focus on, we'd be missing half of the story. There's lots of opportunities to improve the quality of dialogue across this institution, even at the department level. 43 gives us some insight into that quality of dialogue. Can we disagree without being disagreeable, right? Can we argue our ideas without becoming personal? 55, yet another communication statement. We'll look at those collectively as well. So we're going to now segue into our opportunities. So this should look familiar. This was the right half of our initial slide where we saw both strengths and opportunities. So a couple of these headlines, notably the resource constraints and performance management accountability, there are a number of factors that are playing into those. So resource constraints, item number 4, we're just asking in general. Do you have the resources you need to be effective? 29, we're asking about staffing. 31, we're asking about facilities. And item number 11, we're asking about compensation. You may recall that the benefits, I said the benefits was a relative strength. It was an item that was frequently referenced in the verbatims. Our positive response on that item was 64%, which if we do just kind of an item-to-item analysis, that benefits versus this item 11, 64 versus 48, it's a pretty big gap, right? And when I see that kind of gap, one of the things that's often at play is faculty and staff don't understand either the compensation philosophy of the university or the compensation system. So one of the things that I understand is already in the works here, and one of the things that we're seeing more and more colleges and universities do are providing tools, whether they be self-service online tools or otherwise, providing information that helps faculty and staff understand the total value of all the compensation pieces, the compensation of the value of the benefits and associated benefits that may not necessarily be directly reflected or one see reflected in your direct deposit or your check. So a lot of different pieces here, and unfortunately, these are issues that don't get solved overnight. Nobody's able to simply manufacture more money. All colleges these days are having to find ways to be more resourceful, to do more with less. And I think it's important to acknowledge these are real pain points for many faculty and staff. And as I alluded to earlier, when there are resource constraints themes, it also can be viewed as fairness or respect themes as well, right? It's not fair for you to expect me to serve the same number of students that I've already served when we only have 3 people in our department and we used to have 5, right? Or you don't appreciate how hard we're working now, given that we're constantly being asked to do less than more. So the resource constraint issues, they're real and they can have subsequent impact. One of the things that we're seeing more institutions these days doing, and I'm going to also talk about this when we get to shared governance, is helping faculty and staff understand the business of how the university works. And I'm not trying to corporatize this university. Universities are unique institutions, unlike any other industry and or sector. But if we don't understand what the budgeting model is or what the budgeting process is or how funds are allocated, then we may not be in a great position to understand why those decisions are being made. So that doesn't take the pain from being resource constrained, but it provides a larger context. In fact, I was at it's a elite liberal arts college up in the Northeast a couple months ago, and when I was there, they were doing a training for all their facility, security, and dining service folks on their endowment, right? Here's what, many folks didn't even know what an endowment was, but they're helping people understand, here's what an endowment is, here's why it's important to us, here's what it does for us. So even though that may not be what they're dealing with on a daily basis, it helps them understand the business of that college and how money is allocated and how the institution operates. All right, so performance management is another dynamic theme, performance management and accountability, that's influenced by multiple items here. So item number 17, we're simply asking about the review process itself. Our review process accurate measured by job performance. This notoriously is one of the more difficult things that fall under typically an HR portfolio to do well. There's certainly a role for HR, no question, and most performance review processes also rely on managers, supervisors, leaders to implement. So it's not just an HR thing. And we've got less than our population responding positively to that item, and almost a quarter saying that they strongly disagree or disagree with that. We talked about the onboarding. I would suggest performance management starts even before employees become employees, right? It's even that we're setting expectations in our recruiting, and certainly even before folks show up day one. So hence the orientation is part of this performance management accountability theme. While I did identify supervisors, department chairs as a strength, and I continue to identify that as a strength, I think there are opportunities to enhance both the consistency and the capabilities of those who are in supervisory, managerial, or leadership roles. And when I see results like I do in items 18 and 16, one of the things that I would be curious about, that I would wonder about, is how comfortable we are, and I'll just put myself in the shoes of a department chair here. Am I comfortable and skilled at what I'm going to call difficult conversations, right? So issues of low performance are addressed in my department. Having to tell a fellow faculty member that their performance isn't up to standard, or that their behavior isn't congruent with how we've articulated how we want to engage as a department and what our expectations around civil discourse, those are potentially very difficult conversations. And as a leader, as a manager, if I'm not skilled and comfortable with those conversations, I typically do two things. I either avoid them altogether, or I stumble through them as ineffectively as I possibly can, right? Or I stumble through them and it ends up causing more harm than damage. So I would wonder around the comfort and skill of difficult conversations of those of us here who are in managerial roles. Okay, let's look at a few others. So these items were all part of the 10 custom items. So you can see some, we're talking about difficult conversations. 64 gives us another angle into that. Are we willing to confront difficult and sensitive issues? I had worked with a college recently that one of their values is grit, right? So they've identified three of their values. And they've operationalized those values, defining the behaviors. And one of the ways they've operationalized that value is, and this is almost verbatim, but we modeled the courage to step into the difficult conversations. That may not be it, but it's pretty close to it. So they've got a value, and then with the value, an associated behavior. So, if we're looking at facility with difficult conversations, that may be an angle into that as well. 69, I would suggest, is yet another type of difficult conversation. We do see a better finding, but probably not where we'd ultimately want it, regarding the consequences or ability to deal with disrespectful student behavior. All right, so let's come at this from yet another angle, and that angle is respect and appreciation. And I'm going to put on that curious hat again. Item 9, generally, this is a dynamic that fundamentally plays out between an employee and their immediate supervisor in terms of that sense of being recognized, right? So I would wonder about our supervisors. Are we as good about catching people doing things right and acknowledging and celebrating that as we are about catching them when they come up short, right? I would be curious about that. But today, 43% of our folks saying that they're not regularly recognized. When you top that or pile that on top of some of the other things that we saw, it informs for some the sense of disconnection or a sense of not feeling appreciated for the good work they're doing. Item 35 is about recognition awards programs. This item surfaced as a low item also when you did the survey in 2013. That partially informed the implementation of the STARS program. So you do have some evidence that this data can be used to hopefully impact change. I think what you'll see different here in 2018 versus 2013 is not just a more robust data set with more voices and customized demographics, but I think you'll see a greater commitment from senior leadership, particularly the senior leadership team, to use this data to support the work that you all are trying to do. 65, again, yet another custom statement around celebrating accomplishments. Question?
Not a question, more of a statement. Sorry for the interruption. I love the whole the surveys and the presentation of PowerPoint, and I get that it's more easier to hand out a survey and understand what's going on than dealing it person to person, because you have a huge faculty. So then, and it's too much. It would be chaotic for everyone to like circle up and understand what's going on. But and maybe what I've learned from SGO is that when they gave us a survey, they go at it. They find angles to take action. To find what we need, and they try to find a way to fulfill our needs. And it's really hard. It's hard to fulfill everyone's needs. And Rome is not built in a day. NJCU is not built in a day. And NJCU has a long way to go. And what I'm trying to say here is that what is your course of action? What are you going to do with all these things that you're learning from your faculty? Like like these percentages are low. What are your course of action? I haven't heard little of what you're trying to do. I want to learn more of what you're trying to do than the numbers, because numbers are they're numbers, but actions are louder than words.
Yeah. So there's a question inherent in the statement, and the question is, how is this survey data going to be used? What actions are we going to take? And at the risk of being flipped, what am I going to do? It's not my data set. I'm not going to do anything. The question is, what are you all going to do? Now, I say that half in jest, or very much in jest, because my colleagues and I at Modern Think will support in whatever ways we can. Let me deal with the statement and the question let's take a step back for a second, and let's revisit what a survey is. It's an assessment tool, and it's a communication tool. And as I mentioned earlier, we've asked people to tell us what they think. It is only good form to play that back. So that's where we are in the process. We're socializing the data with the community as a whole. We're starting that process of disseminating the data. We're in the early stages of that. I appreciate your bias for action. What are we going to do? And first, before we do anything, we got to make sure we understand this. And we got to make sure that we're aligned as a community in terms of what this is telling us and how we're going to prioritize what we do. Right? So we're not there yet. I think of two phases post-survey. One is the communication of the results. The second is the action planning. And President Henderson's going to talk here shortly. The current thinking, given that you've not done a lot of surveys like this and rolled them out, we don't have a roadmap to follow. So we're making it up as we go. Sounds a little flip as well, but we're creating a process, and the process is going to include some task force, which will tackle some of these issues. So I appreciate the observation and the bias for action, right? So yeah, we don't want survey data just to sit on a shelf. We want to use it to inform what we're doing. All right, so let's talk. We talked about respect and appreciation a little bit. Let's talk about it just a little bit more. So we had, again, some additional statements that got to welcoming environment, sense of belonging. You get a sense of that belonging in item 63. 62 is related to the diversity, equity, inclusion statements that we saw earlier. Item 37 mirrors item 61, that dynamic around senior leadership caring about folks. So we see a similar pattern there. And item 60, the faculty value the contributions of staff. This is also a really important item to look at by demographic groups, right? And is that in fact the case? You know, there is, within higher ed, right, if we look at higher ed as a whole, there are a lot of kind of natural tensions, right? There's tensions between, if you're in the publics, between systems and the member institutions, or between legislatures and boards. In privates, there's tensions between boards and cabinets, between faculty and staff, between faculty and administration. Those are all kind of par for the course. Those are natural tensions, dynamic tensions within higher ed. And what we want to avoid is those tensions escalating to the point where we're all stuck in our camps and we're just kind of looking out for our own interests. So coming back to earlier, my unsolicited counsel in terms of working with this data and moving forward, be curious, be solution-oriented, be a partnership mindset. This has to do with that partnership mindset, right? I encourage you to obviously we're all going to have different priorities, but at the end of the day, our individual success is going to be dependent on our collective success. So how is it we work together regardless where we sit in the organization and what title that we have? And item 68 is, in some regards, that's not a bad finding. I've seen some institutions where staff, it's almost like second-class citizens or even more. And clearly room for improvement there as well. So now we're going to look at a hierarchy here: communication, collaboration, and shared governance. So the communication opportunities, while they're clear, everyone's loud and clear, we want more communication from and with senior leadership. There are some items that have nothing to do with senior leadership, and there's still opportunity. So item 8, when I offer a new idea, I believe it will be fully considered. If we want to tap into the wisdom, the experience, the insight of our community, if we want to be creative and innovative, this is an item we want to do really well on. Now, it's not saying that everybody's idea is going to be fully implemented, but do you at least believe and have a sense of confidence that it's going to be heard, right? That's what we're getting at in item 8. Item 21, we're looking at quality of dialogue in the department. The frame of reference is very specific. Item 22 is more macro regarding changes that affect me or discussed prior to being implemented. I was on the phone yesterday with college, a fair bit bigger than you all, when they had a new president who came in and did a reorganization of his senior leadership team. Then they had a provost who came in and did an academic structure reorganization, and their survey results, lots of people weren't happy about it. And as we were kind of dissecting that, they realized that, we did all these reorganizations, and we didn't tell anybody why we're doing those, right? So when there are changes, whether they be reorganizations or updates to strategic plans or responses to our creditors, it's important to keep the community informed in a timely manner and making sure people understand the rationale with which decisions are made. 43, another communication statement about that quality of dialogue. 66, we're asking specifically about this talked over dynamic. Do people feel like their voices are heard, which is related but different than what we see in item 8. Second half of our communication collaboration decisions, 13 and 23, the frame of reference is at the department level, and we'd see better results there. Item 23, people in my department work well together, we have opportunities to contribute. In item 13, when we expand that frame of reference, item 26 and 58, much lower results. 58, as I mentioned earlier, related to that item 59, the perception of a special and unique culture. So given where we were on 59, I'm not surprised that there's not a great sense of really everybody working together and having each other's back and being on the same team. And that's something you can change. So shared governance. So shared governance, like communication, I think it's easy to talk about in the abstract, right? Who's not for good communication or who's not for shared governance? And the reality is they're much more complex than that. I've seen hundreds of shared governance models. There is no one right shared governance model. Item 38 here, we're not asking, is your shared governance model effective? We're just asking, is the role of faculty in shared governance, is it clearly stated and publicized? Do people know what the role of faculty is in your shared governance model? And less than half our population responds positively. I would suggest if people don't understand or know what the shared governance model is, then they're not going to be in a good position to ascertain whether a decision has been appropriate, collaborative or not, or where the decision-making rested on whatever decision folks may be invested in having a hand in. We do see a better result on item 39 regarding faculty input regarding the education program at 50 and 22. 42, 46, and 55, again, give us different insight into the sense that we're working together or that there's consistent and or regular communication. So I'd ask that rhetorically. I mean, what is, at this point, and this might be a good activity for one of the task force, is how is it we create a greater sense of one university? How is it we create a greater sense of partnership? How is it we build on the collaboration that's happening, in many cases at a good level at the work group or the department, so that it extends across departments and across colleges? Okay, senior leadership. So we talked, some of these items we saw earlier, either in our bottom 10 or elsewhere. And as I mentioned earlier, I found your senior leadership team not just to be open to the data. Certainly some of them were not happy that it wasn't more positive. And I also found them sufficiently motivated to, yes, let's take this on. We can do this. And I already know there's some initial thinking around some work that the senior leadership team can do as they look at how they work together as a team so that they model some of the same kinds of things that would ultimately serve the university well. All right, in the interest of time, I want to switch first to recommendations, and then we'll go to some next steps. So these are high-level recommendations. So it's not going to be as granular as I'm sure you want, but they're high-level recommendations appropriate for where we are in the process. So as I mentioned, good survey practice, communicate the results. I was here a month ago communicating the results to the senior leadership team. I'm here today doing 2 town hall meetings, and this will not be the end of it. So we'll talk more about what some of those next steps potentially are. You've got a lot of potential strategic linkages, right? So you've got your middle states work that you're doing. You've got a strategic plan that you've just extended a little bit. There's been dialogue over the years about values and leadership competencies. So there's a lot of things that are in the periphery that this data could very much support and inform some of that work. I don't think we need a task force for this, but I think it is important to know that, as I mentioned, the senior leadership, I think, heard these results loud and clear and is invested in doing something about them. Among the things I talked with them about is, if we want to create a greater sense of connection to and confidence in senior leadership, one way to do that is looking at visibility, interaction, and relationship. And we heard that loud and clear in the comments. Folks were eager for more connection with senior leadership. So we've offered a recommendation here in 3 around visibility, interaction, and relationship to foster some of that connection, create a greater sense of confidence in senior leadership, and a greater sense of alignment across the university. Given what we saw on those communication and collaboration statements, I hesitate to call it an audit. I think that has too heavy-handed, but I think it's probably worthwhile doing at least a review of kind of the communication structures, processes, and norms. What are you all doing to create a culture of dialogue? I had occasion to work with the university in Missouri not long ago, and they essentially did a crowdsourced activity. They brought about 200 people together in a room of round tables, and they gave each table, actually 2 or 3 tables had the same topic. One of them was around communication, and they did a 30-minute exercise they called Stop, Start, and Continue, where the tables brainstormed for 30 minutes, and the tables that had communication as their topic identified what are the things that we're doing regarding our communication processes that frankly aren't working, so let's stop doing them. Let's stop wasting those time, money, and resources. What are we doing that is working, and let's make sure we continue doing those. And what are some things we should start doing? And in essentially 45 minutes, it was amazing the quality of content that those 3 tables were able to come up with. So whether it's a roundtable exercise or something, I think that's probably something similar to that may serve you well. Similarly, given what we saw in terms of the performance management and the accountability statements, everything from the onboarding process to the review process to confidence that promotions are handled in an equitable way, it probably is also looking at what are we doing regarding system structures and process that theoretically should be in place to ensure that we do have a culture of accountability. So these are obviously high-level recommendations, and this is actually a good segue not just to questions, but also next steps. So in terms of next steps, so the current thinking is that we'll convene some task force, a couple of task force that would have both faculty and staff representation, and that would also have good representation across other demographic groups, whether it be college or department or what have you, so that we're getting multiple perspectives. In terms of the composition of those task force, also talked about making sure that we're not just relying on the same old volunteers, right? The people who are already doing a lot of this work. How is it we can tap into other folks? So I think there's probably a role for people to volunteer on task force, and I think there's also potentially a role to invite specific folks to participate in the task force, either for their own professional development opportunity or the unique lens they might bring. We've also talked about making sure that the charge of these task force is very clear. What is it we're tasking them to do? What authority do they have? Who do they ultimately report to? So much of this is a work in progress, but that's the current thinking. To seed our question and answer, let me ask you to do this real quick. Let me ask you just to turn, so you've got 2 or 3 colleagues, groups of 3 or 4, no more than 3 or 4, and in a very brief conversation with your new colleagues, if you don't know each other, first off, introduce yourselves, right? Maybe you'll meet a new friend today. And once you've done that, look at it, we're building community already. I will ask you we don't have a lot of time, but over the next minute or two, in your small groups, I want you to just talk amongst yourself with any questions you might have, either for me or for any of the senior leadership team members in the room, because we have a number of them in the room. Questions that you might have, or any comments or reactions you might have to anything you've seen thus far, right? So I'll call you back as a large group in about 2 minutes. Folks, another 30 seconds. We'll come back together as a large group in about 30 seconds. All right, coming back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and welcome back. Welcome back, folks. All right, so all those comments I read about the sense of community and the appreciation for relationship, looks like there's some reality to that. You all genuinely seem to like each other, or you're doing a nice job pretending. So thanks for indulging me in that conversation. 2 quick thoughts real quick before we open it up. One about surveys. So I recognize we've got some students here, right? And while students were invited to participate in this survey, you all do participate in the NESI survey every year. And the NESI survey, while it's not this exact item, there's some content overlap. As there is with the FESI survey and the coach survey. Those are all different surveys, but because you've got a number of different data sets, and while I've not seen those findings, I understand from your colleagues who have seen all the survey results that there's a lot of consistency, right? And we can triangulate across these different instruments to point us to some of the areas that are consistently showing up. So that's some good news there. On that note, one of the other things, just a quick best practice, obviously in my business, we're very sensitive to survey fatigue, right? You all have done what we say, coach, NESI, FESI, you've done this survey now. So in terms of strategic connections, this is simple but elegant in its simplicity, I think. We're seeing many colleges these days be much more thoughtful about documenting all the various surveys they participate in, who the audience is, what the timing of the survey is, how the results are used, and how the surveys connect or support each other. So that rather than competing for eyeballs, people see this as a more concerted effort, right? More integrated survey approach as opposed to just being one-off surveys. Last piece on surveys, because we like surveys, and we want to get feedback. As I mentioned, we don't have the roadmap here. You're going to likely get an email, if you've not already, with the opportunity to provide some feedback either about the town hall meetings. You can say, wow, we had this really great presenter, dynamic, fun, one of the best I've ever seen. Or you could offer some thoughts you might have regarding things that are important to you regarding moving forward, whether it be action planning or communicating the results or the ability to see other slices and dices of data. All right, that's all I've got. So you had seems like some good conversations, seems like some folks met some folks. Any questions or comments that emerged from your conversations that you'd like to put forward? Yes?
Collecting the qualitative
Yeah.
I've been here for quite some time, and we just had a survey, I guess it was the coach one, and there was going to be a task force, and the task force will meet, and then they'll do a thing, and then they'll send the recommendations, and then, oh, well, that's the end of that task force, and on to the next one. And so I wonder if there doesn't need to be a place where people can expand on what
Yeah.
what was the impetus behind the box that they checked, and then that might give you more meaning to whatever action you want to take next. It's like, there's a lot of interpretation
Yeah.
that you need beyond the
So I hear a question and an observation, and let me play them back for the benefits on the folks who are watching remotely or recording, because they may not have, the mics not have picked that up. So regarding the observation, there's the fact that, hey, we did a survey recently, the coach survey. There was a task force assembled. There were recommendations made, but not sure really where that went or anything really happened. And for me, that speaks to both a need for more accountability with this process, right? And to the extent there's some lesson learned from what we did with coach, we absolutely want to capitalize on that. And also that's very much related to what we were just talking about in terms of survey fatigue and making sure our efforts are coordinated and aligned. So to the extent that task force has done some work, that's probably work product we want to surface and share with task forces that we have here.
I don't even know if there was one. I know there was going to be one.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, that task force has not yet been convened.
Perfect. We don't have any rework to do then. Right. Yeah, but that's a good example of potentially coordinating pieces. Now, there was a question around, is it too soon to jump to task force, or is there some potential in some additional qualitative efforts, maybe some interviews or focus groups, to dig deeper on some of these findings? And you can absolutely do that. And that may be, depending on how you task the task force, that may be something that task forces want to do. That, you know what, we're looking at performance management and accountability, we need some more data, we're going to convene some focus groups. So it could happen it doesn't have to happen independent or prior to the task force, but the short answer to your question, is there value in doing some additional qualitative inquiry to better understand some of the dynamics here? Absolutely. And there's lots of different ways to do that. Focus groups, round bunches, interviews. And if you've got some thoughts on how you think that would be best handled, absolutely document those either in the survey or connect with Natalie and or Sue, who have been kind of quarterbacking this process. Appreciate the observation and the question. Thank you. Up front.
I'm kind of curious as to why there is such a huge gap between the senior leadership level and the faculty and staff level. Like, that seems to be where the numbers are at the lowest.
Yeah. There's definitely a gap there. And I've got some thoughts on this, but let me just throw it. Anyone have a working theory, a hypothesis on why there might be a gap between some of the senior leadership results and some of the other results? No wrong answers, just brainstorming, crowdsourcing. Sure.
I too have been here a very long time, and I find that years ago, you may not have liked the rules, but you knew what the rules were. Now, you have no clue what the rules are.
Yeah.
And I think there's been a very significant change over the last, 3-4 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be. I think, one of the things, I'll just speak to that, and I'm sensitive to time here as well. I want to model being accountable for the time commitment we made, and that you all have offered here. So I think, no question, that could be a contributing dynamic. Some of it, I think, is as simple as visibility and interaction relationship. People aren't connected to, they don't see senior leadership. Senior leadership have knowledge about things that many folks don't have knowledge about in terms of budgeting and sometimes governance issues. So that often, when there's those dynamics in play, that sometimes informs some of what you see in terms of a gap here. I'm going to come back just for a second in terms of the piece here around rules. I think you all have done some starts and stops over the years in terms of identifying values.
I'm using rules as a really general term.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's consistency of expectations, consistency of behavior, right? And my sense is that that work around values and leadership competencies would serve you all well. So those who are in leadership roles know what's expected of them in terms of the leadership guidance they're providing and an articulated set of values. And again, this is not, you've all have done this in the past. I'm just not sure you've gotten to the point where it's gotten real traction. But when we have an articulated set of values, that helps guide behavior on this. I'm sensitive to time. President Henderson, any thoughts you want to offer in terms of closing? And Sue, Natalie? Yeah.
I haven't looked at the coach data for a long time, but a lot of the findings in the coach were consistent with this. Maybe what we'll do, Sue, is to look and see what the plan was for that, and see if we can bring it together. If not, I'm happy to do the task forces. This one, what your recommendation was that we brought in people from across the sector, all the way from groundskeepers to, faculty, staff. So you're very inclusive because the themes are institutional wide. You may want to do a different one for coach because that's specifically to the faculty experience. So maybe we better think about those being two different things. So, although I think that these were percentage very similar. I will share with you, and I said this at the beginning, that one of the things that the senior team and I are working on is how we work better together. Because if we work better together, then I think we serve the institution better. So I agree with you there in terms of being much more clear about expectations. The best thing that ever happened to us is the VP's meeting where Sue Gerber came in and said, I've gone through every policy we have at this institution. Here was her observation. She pulled up all of our policies as they are, such as they are. She went to Ramapo, Montclair, College of New Jersey, and said, look, these 50 look the same across all three institutions. There's 10 more that Ramapo has that we haven't thought of that perhaps we need to think about creating. And we need to put these all in a very consistent format. So the first assignment was to put all in consistent format, whether they were good, bad, or indifferent. So that's done. But the next piece now is then to think about, well, what are some policies that we ought to be doing today that have come about. If you think about Title IX 10 years ago, it wasn't what it is today. And that is a policy that we have to, as an institution, I have to update every 6 months because something missing comes down that they tell us we have to do it this way instead of that way. So we try to be consistent on that because it's the right thing to do. Anyway, so that's a little bit about the policies, but then, and there was an observation made yesterday also in the Senate, I'm going to get clarity from you, Chris, on which of the policies you passed out of the Senate need to go to the board of trustees. So that was on my issue list. So we'll work on that. But task force, I loved your idea. Let's make sure we get volunteers, but I also, there are some really cool people here with this institution that would never raise their hand because they're just busy coming in and doing the thing. But every time you talk to them, they really have some good ideas. I want to make sure they got put on these task forces because I think it should be very good. Their perspectives you may never thought of.
President Henderson, for the benefit of the tape, I'm going to try and recap just a little bit of some of what you're saying. No, I should have called you over here earlier. But for the benefit of having this documented, and for those who are watching virtually now, our recent conversation was just around the importance of consistency of policies and effective policies. And that there was a recent audit done by Sue Gerber that identified where some of those opportunities may be in terms of identifying some policies. And President Henderson also was referencing a faculty senate meeting where some things surfaced that we need to follow up with some board. So that's important work. President Henderson was also talking about the task force and how we're open to ideas regarding, how best to structure these and the importance of aligning efforts so we're not duplicating efforts. So to the extent that we've got another data set with Coach that we haven't acted on yet, operative word there yet, we can take this opportunity to jumpstart that and potentially, rather than have competing task forces, align those efforts in some form or fashion. And that could look like take a number of different forms. I'm sensitive to time. I do one more question, and then I'll stick around up here if anybody wants to field questions afterwards. But yes, in the back.
So I want to say I appreciate the administration going through this process because I think in many ways it's not easy for the administration and it's an effort to change the culture here in a way that everybody will respect. So I strongly say
Yeah. And for the benefit of the tape, I'm just going to replay here to essentially 2 requests there. And identification that shared governance, whether articulate or not, has been a value of this institution, and that in kind of our commitment to that value, one of the things that might be helpful moving forward is more either information and or involvement regarding financial decisions. So there's a lot to potentially consider there in terms of both informing folks around what the rationale is and potential inclusion in decision-making processes. So the request there. So noted. The second item in the comments was related to the benefit of the task force being truly a joint task force, not just faculty and staff, professional staff, but also administration. So really creating an opportunity to model some of that partnership everybody's so thirsty for. So I think that's great. And that's, on that note, I'll leave that for the last note for me on this, is that, how you all move forward with these survey results in terms of additional communication and action planning, there's an opportunity within that process to model the things that people say they want more of, right? We don't have to wait for a bulleted list of action items to do. If people say they want more transparency, let's be as transparent as we possibly can with the survey results. Let's be collaborative as we can in terms of the composition of our task force. So even in addressing the issues that surface this, we have an opportunity for that process to be an intervention in and of itself. Folks, I'll stick around. You've been a great audience because I didn't see anybody nod off in this difficult time slot, so thank you. And we did get the coffee. If you didn't get the coffee yet, get the cup of coffee on the way out. And if you have additional questions you want to surface or bring to my attention, don't hesitate to either visit with me now or shoot me an email or call afterwards. Thanks a lot, folks. Have a great day.